The kill was messy. That was the first thing Captain Dreshval noted in the engagement log, reviewing the sensor footage in the aftermath of what should have been a routine interdiction exercise, the kind of controlled scenario that the Galactic Military Compact ran twice a year to evaluate joint force readiness, designed to produce clean data and predictable outcomes and nothing that required a flag in the incident report. He noted it clinically, the way you note whether human pilot, first live engagement, kill confirmed, execution irregular. Irregular was a generous word. The target drone had been stationary, the engagement window had been generous, and Cadet Miradon had taken 11 seconds longer than any other pilot in the exercise to fire. When she fired, she missed the designated targeting zone by 40 meters. The drone was destroyed anyway. The weapon's blast radius was sufficient to cover the error, but the miss was logged, and the 11-second hesitation was logged, and the specific quality of her voice in the cockpit recording was logged, which was standard, and which Dreshval reviewed because something in the audio flagged his attention. She had not said anything during the 11 seconds. The audio was silence. And then, after the kill, one word. Not a combat declaration, not a standard confirmation call. One word, exhaled rather than spoken, in her own language rather than compact standard. He didn't have a translation for it immediately. He filed a request. The translation came back the following morning. The word was, sorry. Dreshval looked at the translation for a long time. He made a note in the incident report. Pilot response post-engagement, atypical, requires monitoring. He did not know, could not have known, reviewing 11 seconds of hesitation and one word of audio, that he was looking at the beginning of something. That the footage he had just flagged as a minor performance irregularity would be reviewed again and again and again in briefing rooms across the compact for the next 6 years. Not because of the miss. Because of the 11 seconds. Because of what those 11 seconds meant about the mind inside the cockpit. And because of what that mind would eventually become. The laughter came from the observation deck. It was not malicious, or at least it did not begin as malicious. It was the specific laughter of experienced combat pilots watching a first-year cadet do something that looked, from the outside, like the textbook definition of failure. The Dorothy pilots who had gathered at the observation window were not cruel beings. They were professionals who had been flying combat for years, and the gap between what they saw in the footage and what a combat pilot was supposed to look like was genuinely, objectively large. 11 seconds. 40 meters off target. Sorry. She apologized to a drone, one of them said. This produced more laughter. What it did not produce was concern. Because concern would have required them to ask why she had hesitated, and the obvious answer, fear, inexperience, inadequate training, the basic human limitation that had been so well established in galactic assessments of the species that it barely warranted discussion anymore, was readily available and seemed sufficient. Cadet Miradon was 21 years old, the first human pilot admitted to the Compact's advanced combat program on the strength of simulation scores that had raised some eyebrows and some skepticism in equal measure, and she had just taken 11 seconds to fire at a stationary target and missed it by 40 meters. The skeptics felt confirmed. The eyebrow raisers said nothing because there was, at this point, nothing useful to say. Mira heard about the laughter later, the way people hear about things at training facilities, through the specific osmosis of shared spaces and overheard conversations and the third party who mentions it with an apologetic expression that somehow makes it worse. She was in the simulation bay when she heard. Running the same targeting sequence for the 4th consecutive hour, the headset in, the numbers running, the process of doing the work regardless of what the work felt like. The person who told her was Soa, another first-year, Valhari, one of the few cadets in the program who had sought Mira out rather than waited to be sought, for reasons that Mira had not yet fully understood. They were laughing, Soa said. About the audio. The word you said. Mira ran the targeting sequence again. Pulled left on the approach vector by 6 degrees. Watched the numbers shift. Ran it again. I know, she said. Does it bother you? The sequence ran. The numbers resolved. She pulled out of the headset. Yes, she said. But not for the reason they think. Soa looked at her. They think it bothers me because they were laughing, Mira said. It bothers me because I missed. So it was quiet for a moment. The drone was destroyed. By the blast radius, Mira said. Not by the targeting. There's a difference. She put the headset back in. I need another hour in here. Soa did not leave immediately. She stood at the edge of the simulation bay and watched Mira run the sequence, and she noticed something that she would later mention to 3 different people, and that would later be cited in a profile that none of them could have anticipated writing at this point. She noticed that Mira did not look frustrated. Frustrated was what you looked like when the process was failing you. Mira looked the way a person looks when they have identified a specific problem and are working on the specific problem with the specific tools available to them, and intend to keep doing this until the problem resolves. She looked like someone doing arithmetic. Soa left. Mira ran the sequence for another 90 minutes, until the simulation bay closed for the evening, at which point she moved to the adjacent practice space and ran it on the manual targeting equipment until the lights automatically dimmed at 2300. She went to her quarters. She slept for 6 hours. She was back in the simulation bay at 0530. Nobody was laughing by the end of the week. Not because the situation had changed dramatically. Her live exercise performance was still developing, still inconsistent in ways that the veteran pilots could identify and categorize. But something about the specific quality of her work ethic had produced a silence where the laughter had been, and silence is its own kind of assessment. The assessment the Dorothy pilots arrived at was, she's working hard. Compensating for limitations. Admirable effort, realistic ceiling. This assessment would be wrong. But it would take them a while to learn how wrong. The first misinterpretation resolved 60 days into the program. The live exercise was a pursuit scenario, a target making evasive maneuvers across a 3-dimensional engagement space, the kind of scenario that required not just targeting accuracy but predictive calculation, the ability to anticipate where the target would be rather than where it was. It was the scenario type that the program's historical data showed as the strongest predictor of genuine combat effectiveness, because it was the scenario type that most required something beyond trained skill. It required intuition, the accumulated, below-conscious pattern recognition that experience built over time. Most first-year cadets had very little of it. Miradon's pursuit score on day 60 was the highest in the cohort. Not the highest for a first year. The highest across all years in the current cycle. Captain Dreshval reviewed the footage. He reviewed it twice. Then he called up the targeting data and looked at the predictive calculations she had made, the decisions embedded in her flight path, the places where she had moved in a direction that the target's current trajectory didn't indicate and that the target had moved to anyway. He ran the math backward. Tried to reconstruct the predictive logic. He could not. Not because the logic was absent. Because the logic was operating faster than his reconstruction could follow, making micro-adjustments at intervals that were smaller than the conscious decision threshold for his species. She was not calculating where the target would go. She was perceiving it. He called her in. The pursuit scenario, he said. Walk me through your targeting decisions at the 40-second mark. You shifted vector 12 degrees before the target initiated its turn. She looked at him. The approach angle suggested the turn was coming, she said. What in the approach angle? She was quiet for a moment. The acceleration pattern, she said. When an evasive system builds toward a turn, the acceleration profile has a specific shape about 3 seconds before the initiation. It's not visible in the navigation data, but in the engine output numbers she paused. It's more of a feeling than a data point. The numbers feel like they're about to change. He stared at her. You were reading the engine output numbers, he said. In peripheral, she said. I know the main display is the targeting system, but the engine output is in the lower left corner and I started tracking it about 2 weeks ago because I noticed the pattern. He looked at the display configuration in her cockpit recording. The engine output numbers were in the lower left corner. They were not in the standard attentional hierarchy of the targeting interface. No training document told pilots to watch them. She had noticed a pattern in data that she was not supposed to be looking at. She had been watching it for 2 weeks. She had not mentioned it to anyone. Why didn't you report this? He said. I wasn't sure it was real yet, she said. I'm still not sure it's real. It might be confirmation bias. I might be remembering the times it predicted correctly and forgetting the times it didn't. She met his gaze. I'd rather have more data before I tell anyone. He looked at her. The laughter from the observation deck 60 days ago had been about 11 seconds and a missed target and a word in her own language that meant sorry. The laugh was about inadequacy, about limitation, about the gap between performance and standard. He was sitting across from the pilot who currently held the highest pursuit score in the cycle, who had found a predictive signal in a non-standard data channel through 2 weeks of unsupervised pattern recognition, and who had not reported it because she wanted more data before she was certain. "What made you apologize?" he said. "After the first engagement." She looked at him. It was clearly not the question she had expected. "The drone wasn't a person," she said. "But I was practicing killing something. And I missed." She paused. "I apologized because I missed, and because I was practicing killing, and because both of those things seemed like they deserved acknowledgement." She looked at her hands. "I know it sounded strange." "It sounded very strange," he said. "I know," she said. It was still true. He filed a revised note in her record. The note said, "Not what I thought I was looking at." The misinterpretation that proved most consequential happened at month 4, and it began with a question that Dreshval asked during a tactical debrief that was supposed to be routine. The exercise had involved a simulated 3-on-1 engagement, standard attrition training, designed to test performance under pressure with adverse odds. Every pilot in the program ran it. The expected outcome was performance degradation under pressure, the identification of stress response patterns, data that informed subsequent training emphasis. Miradon's performance in the 3-on-1 had not degraded. It had changed. Significantly. In directions that the attrition training was not designed to produce. "You changed your approach at the 90-second mark," Dreshval said in the debrief. "You stopped using the evasion protocol. You stopped trying to avoid being hit." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She looked at the debrief display showing her flight path. "Because the evasion protocol was keeping me alive but not resolving the situation," she said. "And the situation needed to resolve. So I stopped optimizing for personal survival and started optimizing for engagement termination." He stared at her. "You stopped trying to survive." "I stopped prioritizing survival over mission completion," she said. "Those are different things." "You took 3 hits in the subsequent 40 seconds. "Yes," she said. "But I terminated 2 of the 3 targets in that period, which changed the odds significantly." She looked at him steadily. 3-on-1 with evasion protocol running is a slow death. 3-on-1 where you accept some damage to change the geometry is survivable. The math is different once you stop treating your own survival as the constraint. Dreshval looked at her for a long moment. "What is the constraint?" he said. "If not your survival?" She looked at the display. "Winning," she said simply. "That's the constraint. Everything else is a variable." He wrote in his notes, *personal survival classified as variable, not constraint. Verify whether this is philosophical posturing or operational reality. *. 3 weeks later, in the next major exercise, she took 2 hits in the opening exchange to put herself in position to end the engagement in 4 moves, rather than avoiding damage and extending the engagement for 22. It was not philosophical posturing. He sent the exercise footage to 2 colleagues with a note that said, "I need someone else to watch this and tell me if I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing." Both colleagues watched it. Both colleagues said yes. All 3 of them filed a joint assessment that was the first document in the Compact's records to use a specific phrase about Cadet Miradon that would, in the following 6 years, appear in 43 subsequent documents, each time with a slightly different understanding of what it meant. The phrase was, "threat calculus inconsistent with species baseline." The rehook came from an archivist. Not a military analyst, not a combat assessor, not anyone in the program's chain of command. An archivist named Velsoth in the Compact's Historical Records Division, who had been assigned to catalog a backlog of unsorted First Contact era documents and who had, in the course of that cataloging, found something that should have been in the standard human species assessment file and wasn't. She sent it to Dreshval because his name was on the most recent assessment filed for a human cadet, and the document she had found was directly relevant to the assessment methodology that file had used. She sent it at 14:30 on a Tuesday with a subject line that said, "Possibly relevant to your current work, not urgent." He opened it at 1800 because his day had run long. He was still reading at 2300. The document was from the first contact era, 60 years ago, the early period when Earth had made galactic contact and the Compact had been conducting the species assessments that established the framework for human integration into galactic society. Standard process. Every new species went through it. The assessments became the baseline from which subsequent assumptions were built. The human assessment had concluded, in its summary section, that humans were a species with high individual variation, moderate baseline physical capability, significant emotional volatility that created both cooperative potential and conflict risk, and this was the section that had been in the standard file and had informed everything since. Asterisk limited operational persistence under high-stress extended engagement scenarios, consistent with the short generational cycle and high metabolic demand of the species, asterisk. This conclusion had been the foundation of the Compact's assessment of human military potential for 60 years. It was based on 48 hours of evaluation. 48 hours, conducted with 7 human volunteers, in a single facility, with a single assessment team. The document Velsoth had found was the appendix to that assessment. The section that had not made it into the standard file, not suppressed, not classified, simply lost in the administrative shuffle of an era when the Compact was processing 11 first contact assessments simultaneously and the filing system had not been equal to the volume. The appendix contained a dissent, filed by one member of the 7-person assessment team, a Velhari xenobiologist named Taithmara, who had disagreed with the summary conclusion on the specific point of limited operational persistence and who had filed a formal objection that had gone into the appendix, where appendices go to be thorough and not to be read. The objection was 3 pages long. Dreshval read all 3 pages twice. Taithmara's argument was methodological. She had not disputed the 48-hour observations. She had disputed the conclusion drawn from them on the grounds that 48 hours was radically insufficient to assess persistence in a species whose relevant historical record was 10,000 years long. She had included data. Human military history, the length of their wars, not the technology, the duration, the specific, staggering persistence of conflicts that had lasted not months but years, not years but decades, in cases not decades but generations. Wars that had continued past the point where the available resources should have ended them, past the point where the strategic objectives had transformed beyond recognition, past the point where the original decision-makers were dead and their successors were fighting for reasons that had accumulated in the gap between the war's beginning and its present. She had included casualty figures, not to demonstrate brutality, to demonstrate the specific mathematical fact that humans had continued military operations at casualty rates that, by the assessment team's own analysis of every other species in the Compact, would have produced strategic capitulation. They had not capitulated. They had absorbed the losses. And continued. This species, Taithmara had written in the final paragraph of her dissent, asterisk does not demonstrate limited operational persistence. It demonstrates operational persistence that our assessment framework has no upper bound for. We are measuring them against a scale that ends before they do. The conclusion in the summary is not wrong given the 48 hours of data. It is wrong given the 10,000 years of data that was available and not consulted, asterisk. I formally request that the assessment be expanded. The request had been filed. The appendix had gone into storage. The assessment, with its conclusion about limited persistence, had become the foundation of 60 years of compact understanding of human military potential. Dreshval closed the document. He sat in his office for a long time. He thought about 48 hours and 10,000 years. He thought about a cadet who apologized after a missed kill and ran targeting simulations until the lights dimmed automatically. He thought about personal survival classified as variable, not constraint. He thought about the 60 days of laughter and the silence that had replaced it, and about how the silence was its own kind of wrong, Not malicious wrong, not deliberately wrong, but wrong in the specific way of an assessment built on a 48-hour sample from a 10,000-year dataset. He opened a new document. He wrote at the top, "I need to find out how wrong we've been." Then he started making calls. The 6-month review was the first point at which something beyond Dreshval's chain of command became aware that the situation with Cadet Dawn was not a standard development arc. The review was attended by program leadership, Joint Command assessors, and 2 observers from the Compact's Strategic Intelligence Division who were present because someone senior had flagged the joint assessment document, threat calculus inconsistent with species baseline, and had decided that observers were appropriate. Dreshval presented the 6-month data. The pursuit scores. The attrition exercise. The persistence metrics that showed no degradation across the full 6 months. In fact, showed a slight positive trend, performance improving rather than plateauing in the period when most cadets began to level as their initial gains consolidated and their rate of development slowed. He also presented Taithmara's descent. He presented it without commentary, because he had found that presenting it with commentary produced arguments about the commentary rather than engagement with the data, and the data was what mattered. The room read it. The room was quiet in the specific way of people encountering information that is inconvenient to their existing framework. One dissent, one of the observers said, "From 60 years ago, based on historical data rather than observed performance." "The historical data is relevant," Dreshval said. "The observed performance is also relevant. Together, they suggest the assessment framework we've been using has a calibration error." "You're saying we've been underestimating the species." "I'm saying we've been measuring them against a scale that ends before they do," Dreshval said, using Taithmara's phrase deliberately. "And the cadet currently performing at the top of this cycle is demonstrating why that matters." "One cadet," the observer said. "One data point. One data point that the original assessment should have predicted as possible and didn't," Dreshval said, "because the assessment was built on 48 hours. A silence. "What are you recommending?" program leadership asked. "I'm recommending we let her run," he said. "Full cycle. No artificial ceiling on her training pathway. And I'm recommending we review the species baseline assessment before we make any further institutional decisions that depend on it." The recommendation was approved. Not unanimously. The observers from Strategic Intelligence abstained, which was itself a kind of answer about how they were processing what they had heard. Dreshval walked out of the review and found Soa waiting in the corridor, because Soa had learned to wait in corridors outside rooms where things that mattered were happening, which was one of the things that made her effective in the context she was effective in. "How did it go?" she said. "They approved the recommendation," he said. "And the observers?" He looked at her. "You know about the observers." "I know about most things that happen in this facility," Soa said, without apology. "It's useful." "The observers are going to watch her more carefully," he said, which is not entirely a positive development. Because people who watch more carefully sometimes start managing what they're watching," he said. "And she doesn't need management. She needs the road in front of her to not have a ceiling." Soa was quiet for a moment. "She won't let them put a ceiling on her," she said. "How do you know?" Soa looked at him with the expression of someone who has spent 6 months in close proximity to a person and has arrived at a specific, earned understanding. "Because she doesn't know ceilings are a thing that can be put on her," Soa said. "She hasn't learned to think in those terms yet. She's only thinking about the next problem." Dreshval looked at her. "That's either the most reassuring thing you could have said," he said, "or the most alarming." "Probably both," Soa said. The Year 2 escalation was not a single event. It was a series of events, each one producing a data point, and the data points collectively producing a picture that nobody in the program had been expecting and that several people had to sit with for some time before they could fully articulate what they were looking at. It began with the multi-pilot exercise in month 14, where Mira was assigned to a 4-pilot formation and produced an engagement outcome that the exercise designers described, in their after-action report, as outside projected parameters. She had coordinated the formation using a communication pattern that wasn't in the training manual, not because she had invented it whole, but because she had adapted elements from 3 different formation doctrines, 2 of which were from Earth, military history, and 1 of which was from Dora T. Standard Doctrine, into something that none of the other pilots had been trained to read but that they all, apparently, found comprehensible. The after-action report asked her about the communication pattern. She said she had not planned it in advance. She had noticed, during the exercise, what information the other pilots needed and found the most efficient way to give it to them. "You improvised a formation communication protocol," the debrief officer said. "I communicated what needed to be communicated," she said. "I don't know if that's a protocol." It was, in fact, a protocol. A senior Dora T formation theory specialist reviewed the footage and identified it as a variant of an approach that had been theorized in academic literature but never successfully demonstrated in live exercise, because the cognitive demand of maintaining formation awareness while improvising communication codes was considered beyond the threshold of real-time pilot capacity. She had done it in a 14-month cadet. The specialist's note said, "Either the threshold assessment is wrong, or the human cognitive architecture has properties our models don't account for." It was both. They were the same thing. Month 18. The simulation that the program used to assess readiness for live combat command. A comprehensive multi-phase scenario that the program's designers considered the definitive evaluation of combat leadership potential. Every pilot who had ever gone through the program had taken it. The top score in program history had stood for 11 years. Mira ran it twice. The first run produced a score in the 91st percentile. She requested a second run, citing an error in her execution of Phase 3 that she wanted to correct. The second run produced a score that broke the 11-year record. She came out of the simulation bay and found Soa waiting. "How was it?" Soa said. "Better," Mira said. "Phase 3 still wasn't right. But better. You broke the record." "I know." She picked up her water. "I can still feel where I was slow in Phase 3. It's going to bother me." Soa looked at her. "Mira, you broke the record." "By 4 points, Mira said. "That's inside the margin of scenario variation. I want to run it again when I can do Phase 3 properly, to see if the improvement is real or if I just got a favorable scenario variant." Soa opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You're going to run the record-breaking simulation again," she said, "because you're not sure the record is earned." "I'm not sure the gap between my capability and the record holder's capability is as large as 4 points, Mira said. "The scenario variant affects the score by up to 7 points either direction. I need a clean run to know where I actually am." Soa stared at her. "Dreshval needs to know you said that," she said. "Tell him after I run it again," Mira said. "It's not interesting yet." What happened over the next 4 years was gradual in the way that the growth of something very large is always gradual from the inside and only visible from outside in retrospect. Session by session, exercise by exercise, the picture assembled itself from the data. The pursuit scores that stayed at the top of the cycle through years 2, 3, and 4. The formation protocols that she continued to develop and adapt and that began to filter into the training materials because the program's designers found them useful and didn't initially connect them back to their origin. The simulation record, which she ran 2 more times and improved both times, until the record had been broken 3 times by the same pilot and the concept of the record had begun to feel like a different kind of metric. The specific quality of her failures, because she did fail, and failed regularly, and failed in ways that were instructive rather than demoralizing. She did not hide failures. She brought them to debriefs fully articulated, with her analysis of what had gone wrong and what she intended to change, and her analysis was usually correct, and her changes usually worked, and the pattern of this was more alarming to Dreshval than any single success, because it suggested a relationship with failure that his experience had only rarely seen, not failure as obstacle, but failure as data. She was using her own errors as a training tool. This was, technically, what training was supposed to produce. But the degree to which she had internalized it, the speed with which she extracted usable information from a bad outcome, the absence of the ego-protective mechanisms that caused most pilots to defend against accurate self-assessment, was not typical. He had seen it twice before in his career. Both times in officers who went on to have significant command careers. He was beginning to understand what the program had on its hands. The turning point was not a battle. It was a briefing. Year 5. The program had produced its annual assessment, and the strategic intelligence observers who had abstained from the Year 1 recommendation were now present in force, 3 of them, senior enough to have their own assessment authority, present because someone at a level above Dreshval had decided this was no longer a training program matter. The briefing covered 5 years of data. It covered the performance metrics. It covered the formation protocols. It covered the simulation records. It covered the misinterpretation history, the laughter at month 0, the attrition exercise, the 6-month review, the sequence of moments where the assessment had been wrong and had been revised and had been wrong again and had been revised again, each revision pushing the picture further from where it had started. It covered Taithmara's descent. And then the senior observer, a commander named Rethson, said something that changed the room. The question before this group, he said, is not whether Pilot Dawn has demonstrated exceptional performance. Yes. The question is whether we understand why she has. Because if we don't understand why, we can't generalize. We have one data point and a lot of surprise. He looked at Dreshval. You've been with this pilot for 5 years, he said. You have a theory. Dreshval looked at the data assembled on the briefing display. He thought about 11 seconds and about the engine output numbers in the lower left corner, about personal survival classified as variable, about 48 hours and 10,000 years and an appendix that had gone into storage. The theory, he said, is that we have been misidentifying what makes a combat pilot exceptional. Our framework identifies speed, accuracy, formation adherence, and stress response. We measure these because we have determined they predict effectiveness. They do predict effectiveness, Rethson said. They predict effectiveness within the framework we've built, Dreshval said, which is a framework built on how we think. How Doherty think. How Velhari think. How every species that built this framework thinks. He paused. What Pilot Dawn has shown us across 5 years is that those metrics are a subset of a larger set of variables that we weren't measuring because we didn't know they existed. What are the variables we weren't measuring? Dreshval was quiet for a moment. The willingness to use her own limitations as data, he said. The absence of ceiling thinking. She doesn't know where her ceiling is because she's never stopped looking for it. The specific relationship with failure that produces faster iteration rather than defensive self-protection. He looked at the room. And something harder to name. Something I've been watching for 5 years and can describe in behaviors but not in terms. Try, Rethson said. He thought about the 5 years. About every exercise, every debrief, every run through the simulation, every formation protocol built from 3 different doctrines because she saw what each one had and took it. She doesn't experience her own performance as separate from the mission, he said. For most pilots, for most officers in the compact, there is a self that exists apart from the work. The work is something the self does. Success and failure are things that happen to the self. He paused. For her, the self and the work are not separate things. When she apologized after the first kill, she wasn't apologizing because she was afraid or incompetent. She was apologizing because she understood that the kill was real, and she was present for it as a real thing, not as a performance metric. That's the same quality that makes her take 3 hits to change the geometry. The same quality that makes her run the record-breaking simulation again because she wants to know if the improvement is real. The room was very quiet. She's not performing competence, he said. She's trying to find it. The trying never stops. Rethson looked at him for a long time. And what does that produce? He said. In operational terms, what does a pilot like this actually do in combat? Dreshval thought about it. She gets better, he said, continuously, past the point where most pilots plateau, past the point where the training framework has anything left to give her. She keeps finding the next problem and solving it. For how long? He looked at the 5-year dataset, at the performance curve that had not flattened. I don't know, he said honestly. I've been watching for 5 years. I haven't found the ceiling yet either. By midnight of the day that briefing concluded, Something had shifted in how the Compact's Strategic Intelligence Division thought about what they had on their hands. Not a cadet who had exceeded expectations. Something that required the expectations to be rebuilt from the ground up. By midnight, 3 fleet commanders had received a briefing summary. By midnight, Rethsan had filed a recommendation that used language the recommendation framework did not have a standard category for. Miradan was in her quarters. She was running the targeting sequence from the first exercise she'd run tomorrow morning on a personal training device, reviewing the approach vector she'd identified as improvable. She was unaware that her name was in 3 fleet briefings. She was aware that the approach vector had a 17-degree correction that would shave 0.4 seconds off the engagement window. She ran it again. She would be aware of the briefings eventually. She would be aware of the fleet commanders and the strategic intelligence review and the assessment framework revision that Dreshval had been building for 2 years and that would, in the following decade, become the foundational document for how the Compact understood human military integration. She would be aware of all of it. And she would find it less interesting than the approach vector. Not because she was indifferent to what it meant. Because the approach vector was the thing in front of her, and the thing in front of her was always what mattered, and there was always another thing in front of her, and there always would be. The targeting sequence ran. She noted the correction. She ran it again. Outside her window, the station turned in the dark, and somewhere in the briefing rooms where her name was being spoken by people who were only beginning to understand what they were describing, the question that had started with 11 seconds of silence and 1 quiet word was still running, still open, still without a ceiling, still expanding faster than the framework built to contain it. Which war, someone would ask years from now, when her record had outgrown the categories designed to hold it. And the answer would be the same one it had always been. All of them. Every engagement, accounted for, remembered, learned from, and carried forward into the next one. Not as weight, as fuel. The sequence ran. She noted the correction. She ran it again. The lights did not dim this time. She had disabled the automatic